In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the 2025 federal budget, and it was tabled, recently passed in Parliament. And I've titled this presentation as A Missed Opportunity. As we go through the material together, it'll become abundantly clear to you as why I think it's a missed opportunity. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a roadmap for how we're going to do this presentation together. There's quite a bit of material here, but essentially we're going to, first of all, talk about the current economic reality that we're in. I think it's really important to take a look at that because it puts the budget in the right context. And in my opinion, this budget's not transformational, it's not historic, it's not coming anywhere close to dealing with the fundamental issues that we're facing as a country, and the policies are wrong. So we'll talk about that, and I'll talk about policy positions that I think the government should be considering to course correct in terms of our current situation. We'll talk a little bit about the retirement impacts. So if we don't course correct, what are the ripple effects that all of us have to deal with in a retirement? And I want to be the first to admit that I have biases. I've worked in the financial services industry for a long time, my whole career. I am fiscally to the right of center. And I do think, though, that there's middle ground. I do think that when it comes to government programs, healthcare, infrastructure, the military, all the things that we have come to believe need to be parts of a civil society where we can raise our families and live a high quality of life. We cannot do those things unless we are economically growing to pay the bills for those things. And I feel that most Canadians have not been given enough information to make informed decisions. We get sound bites, we get policy positions, but very rarely are we asked to make trade-off decisions. If we pursue this particular policy, but this and this happens as a result of the policy, do you support it? And I'll give you an example in a few minutes as to what I'm getting at there. So that's the agenda. We'll go through some of the key components of the budget. The first thing, though, that I'm going to do is I'm going to frame for you the current economic situation that we're in. Now, this chart's a really good example, just illustrating GDP per capita, so kind of economic productivity or output per person per capita, adjusted for inflation, and it goes up to 2023. Now, why is this important? GDP per capita is a rough measurement of the productivity and economic output of a region, and those kinds of data points will influence the kind of revenue and tax base and quality of life that people will experience in that jurisdiction. Because ultimately, it'll generate tax revenues. Those tax revenues will be there to provide for infrastructure, roads, highways, and healthcare and education. And it also has an impact on how much money people have to spend to live their lifestyle and enjoy their lives for both themselves and their families. So it's an important output. Now, when you look at all these jurisdictions, there's 60 of them in this chart, going from New York State, Massachusetts, Washington, all the way down to the Atlantic provinces in Canada. Out of the 60 jurisdictions, we've got 3 provinces, PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, at the bottom of this chart. You can see here the 17th and 19th out of the 60 are Alberta, Saskatchewan. Not surprising, they're resource and commodity-rich jurisdictions, and maybe could be even richer if they didn't have to initiate transfer payments to other provinces. If we looked at British Columbia, it's 43rd. And so if we look broadly at this chart, a lot of the Canadian provinces are stacked in the bottom third of all these different jurisdictions. Now, how does that ripple effect to the story I'm going to share with you about Washington State and BC? So this story frames what I think is a really important data set that we need to be worried about. So first of all, the per capita income gap in equivalent currency values is $40,000 per year. So I can be right on the border of BC and Washington State, and already we have a per capita income gap that is very significant between the two jurisdictions. And that's not surprising given the GDP per capita information I just shared with you. Now, personal income tax rates, again, BC is in a very non-competitive situation compared to Washington State. In BC, once you hit a $260,000 of taxable income, you hit a marginal tax rate where 53.5 cents of every dollar goes to taxes, so basically half of your income. Actually, BC holds the 4th highest marginal tax rate on personal incomes in all of North America. And then we look at Washington State, it has no state tax, and you don't hit the top rate in Washington State or federally until you're roughly about $600,000 of income. And at the top rate, you're at 37%. So we've got a situation here where not only are the tax rates lower in Washington State, but the threshold is way higher. And when it comes to the income gap, it's pretty massive on average between people working in Washington State and in BC. Now, why is this important? One of the budget provisions is, I think it's about $1 billion being allocated to attract high talented individuals, immigrants to this country in tech and other areas. And I would propose that our ability to attract that talent will be compromised because of these deficits or gaps. We do not have a competitive tax structure as it relates to individuals. We have a pretty good tax structure, competitively speaking, at the corporate rate. But what's interesting, we've been losing reinvestment back to corporations and the corporate environment for years now. It's been a steady decline, even though we have a very competitive tax regime corporately here in Canada. And then you look at our personal tax regimes, completely non-competitive. What is the chance that we're going to attract people to our country for those jobs that we're trying to feed into tech and other areas, research, universities? I think pretty low. Now, we could have argued maybe 10 years ago, 15 years, 20 years ago, that people would come from all over the world to Canada and maybe pay more taxes, maybe come here because we're parliamentary democracy, there's good governance, the rule of law, we got a good healthcare system, good education system. Those things might have been true 15, 20 years ago. They're not true today. So not only are we non-competitive from a tax standpoint and from an income standpoint or marginal tax rate standpoint, we're increasingly become non-competitive in terms of those other Canadian values that we've always held dear as competitive advantages are no longer advantages. I dare you to look at any of those sectors I talked about, healthcare, education, crime, that are realistically a lot better than the U.S. as an example. So we live in a bubble if we believe that. We've seen a very significant deterioration. So on top of that story around productivity gains and growth, we had the story of inflation. Now that story is not unique to Canada, but you can see already that the Canadian story is one of deficit even before other issues get superimposed upon it. So if we look at our largest trading partner, we're non-competitive. Now, what this chart shows you is we've got basically yearly inflation rates, a consumer price index from 2014 to 2024. And you can see how it's weaved back and forth. And then we saw massive increases through 2022. And then we went down the other side to lower inflation rates. So politicians always love to say we're at 2.2% inflation or 3% inflation. And that all sounds good, but it sounds good when it's said outside the context of the reality. So what I've done here is I've superimposed on top of the yearly inflation rate, the cumulative rate. So if people are wondering why their money's not going as far and they're really experiencing that price inflation in a dramatic fashion, yes, maybe the rate of growth in terms of the consumer price index has slowed down, but it's not like the cumulative increases we've had to absorb have fallen down on the other side here. They haven't. And so Canadians, not only do we have a non-competitive tax system, personal income tax has to come down at some point. We need to figure that one out. Housing affordability is an issue. We've got this productivity gap to the U.S. And then on top of that, we have not had policy positions that have dealt with this cumulative increase in the cost of living. It's not good enough to say that now inflation's down to 3% because we haven't dealt with these fundamental issues around the overall basket of goods and services hitting all-time highs over this time period. So you can see that when you think about a budget, what you'd like to see is a budget that deals with these bread and butter issues for the average Canadian and at the same time can put in place policies that will lead to economic growth so that Canadians on an after-tax basis have more spending power. And governments over time are incurring less deficits and have more tax revenue to enhance services. Now, this chart looks at how Canada ranked relative to a number of countries around the world. It's Ireland, Poland, Hungary, Portugal, New Zealand, United States, Denmark, and then we get all the way down to Mexico, Luxembourg. Here's good old Canada. And what you can see here is that from 2014 to 2022, Canada ranked almost dead last in growing their GDP per person. This is concerning. This is alarming. And one of the interesting things about this number is that this shouldn't be the case. We are one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. We should be ranked right at the top of this list in terms of our economic potential, but that potential has not been leveraged because of policy positions. This is totally unacceptable. And so we're already starting in with a deficit, and we've been dead last in growing our productivity. And we're going to talk about some of the policies that could be initiated that might help to turn the corner in terms of productivity gains. So when you look at the budget, what you need to do is you need to look at it in the context of the current economic landscape. And like I said, do the policies we're talking about deal with these fundamental issues that we're dealing with right now from an economic standpoint? This is another way of looking at it, the average growth rates in percentage terms of GDP per capita of the OECD countries, 2014 to 2022. Again, Ireland's at the top here, Poland, Hungary. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to take a look at the countries that are having growth rates of 3, 3.8, 4.3, 8.4% GDP per capita growth. And then we go all the way down here to Canada, one of the lowest growth rates, almost no growth over that time period. So again, it shouldn't be surprising to us as we look at the economic facts that we're struggling under the weight of increasing deficits, debt levels, and crumbling infrastructure everywhere you look. It's not necessary. And so the question I'll keep asking is, will the current budget deal with these issues? So let's look at the low GDP implications to us at a personal level and country level. So per capita GDP growth is a proxy for average national productivity and living standards. So that, like I said, underpins wage growth, investment returns, cost of living, taxation, all the issues we've been talking about. Number two, the fact that Canada is falling behind the OECD average suggests caution. Slower growth in Canada can affect investment returns potentially, retirement incomes, and broader planning landscape. Okay, so we don't have to be economic geniuses to go, this doesn't look great. And we've got an aging population, we've got crumbling infrastructure, and if we keep going down this track, is our current pension system sustainable? What about old age security benefits? What about Canada as an investment climate? What if a deteriorating economic backstory makes our debt servicing costs higher because our bonds get downgraded? Those are the kinds of ripple effects that we could be experiencing down the road. And it can lead to less buying power, like I've talked about, and governments overwhelmed by their debt service costs. The brain drain that I talked about, we're not going to turn that around. It doesn't matter what the federal government decides to spend on attracting talent to Canada. We may attract some of that talent in the short term, but there was just a study released recently that looked at, there's a very high percentage of new immigrants to this country that are high-skilled, high-talent individuals, and with a relatively short period of time, they're immigrating to the United States. So we are not competitive at a whole host of levels, like I said, to keep that talent. Okay, so let's talk about further implications. Now, I want to talk about some other realities. This is more from a standpoint of young adults who are trying to get a foothold, and we're creating a massive generational conflict potentially. So let's look back at 1969. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was Canada's prime minister. The average home price at that time was around $24,000 in major Canadian cities, and the average annual salary was $6,000 per year. Now, back then, the price-to-income ratio was roughly 4-to-1 in terms of purchasing a house. Fast forward to today, and the average home price in Canada exceeds $700,000 from the $24,000 average at that time, while median household income is about $92,000. So that's a ratio that's 8-to-1. So we've gone from a 4-to-1 ratio back in 1969 to an 8-to-1 ratio today. Home prices have grown far faster than incomes, making housing affordability one of the biggest financial challenges Canadians face. Now, there's some really important policy implications, and I think that, again, if governments are serious about rectifying this situation, although it's municipal governments that have a really big impact on this particular decision, so does deregulation. The federal government can pursue policies around that, and there's some innovative policies that can be put in place to help younger adults to get a foothold into the housing market. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the reality is, if we look at municipal governments and what happens with housing approvals, is that it's not in my backyard kind of mentality for a lot of Canadians. They're fearful about degrading home values. They limit high density growth in certain cities and areas. They're fighting against zoning changes and initiatives that could increase the housing stock in certain areas and provide affordable housing for Canadians. This is an all-of-government exercise that we need to be really leaning into to make sure that we free up the private sector to build more housing stock. And we need to fight through folks that, for their own reasons, don't want that development for fear that it might reduce their property values. We need to find that even-handed approach to helping not just retirees maintain their housing stock value, but also younger adults getting into the market in the first place. This is deplorable. 4-to-1 ratio back in 1969, 8-to-1 ratio today. Something's broken. We need to fix it. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the budget highlights that I thought we should cover off, but then I'm going to talk about what wasn't in the budget and maybe what we should be rattling the cage, talking to our MPs, talking to our elected officials about becoming actually transformational in terms of their approach. Now, one of the things contained in the budget for business I thought was a good idea, and that's the productivity super deduction. And that's the immediate expensing in the first year of new capital assets for businesses to write down very quickly. Here's the problem. Canada already has a pretty competitive corporate tax regime. And yet, in spite of that, year after year, we're losing capital from Canada. So it's not purely a write-off super deduction issue that we're experiencing as a country. Why are we seeing a deterioration of those economic numbers? Businesses do not find Canada to be an attractive place in which to do business. We have not had regulatory certainty. We have biases against certain kinds of industries. So we have regulatory hurdles that get in the way of businesses doing what businesses do best. And as I mentioned, on the personal side, businesses just don't come to Canada purely for business reasons. If they have employees or they're moving senior people to Canada in their operations here, they can take a look at our tax regime and quality of life. And as that's deteriorated, so too has it deteriorated the competitiveness of our country. So it's not really just a super deduction issue. It's a whole of government policy issue that's negatively impacting our ability to attract capital. Now, we could argue that the recent Trump administration and the tariffs have led to a flight of capital. For sure, that may be one of the reasons. But all you need to do is look at the oil and gas and resource sector. They've come up with, I think, 7 to 8 bullet points from a policy standpoint and a regulatory standpoint that if repealed, you'd see a lot of money coming back to Canada for resource development. I think the Carney government's trying to move a little bit in that direction, but it's a woefully inadequate approach that's very fossilized in terms of its speed, very slow. So the next area here is some credits that, again, could be beneficial. We've got home accessibility and medical expense credits, some top-up tax credit for the middle class, some automatic federal benefits for lower-income individuals, and personal support workers tax credit. So we could argue those are positive things, but when I take a look at the tax code, the federal government already knew that they were going to be incurring massive deficits. And I think that we're at a point in time now from a policy standpoint that we need to pivot. What we've been doing has not been working, and I would submit again that what we're trying to do in this new budget is tweaking and not transformational. I think a better approach would have been put more money both in individuals' hands, deregulate, make it easier for business to do what business does best, and that will hit the economy immediately. This major projects office and the whole approach to approving projects, and some of these projects obviously are years and years down the road, that's not going to help Canadians today. We need to have a dramatic shift of policy to get money employed in smart ways at the individual and local community level to impact the economy. I'm not saying that these tax credits or expense credits are unimportant, but they're not going to move the needle in any meaningful way. Now, the next part of this budget discussion might be the most controversial for some people. I want right off the top to say that I think there's climate change, and I think it's a serious issue. I think the debate really has to be what are the solutions, and can we be a little more nuanced and balanced in the solutions? Bill Gates came out recently, much more nuanced in his approach, where he says this is a balancing act between human flourishing and dealing with climate change. And I'd say that the fundamental issue that really should be confronting Canadians and people around the world is balancing off human flourishing with dealing with climate change. And I think a lot of times people haven't had full information. We'd all put up our hands to say that we're in favor of policies that would limit our impact on the climate and to move in the right direction in that area. But we need to be able to answer that question with another set of facts that say, but this is the impact. Here are the trade-off decisions. And we've lived that the last decade. So as we pursue policies that limit growth, particularly in fossil fuels as an example, we are a resource-rich country, and we've intentionally, through policy decisions and creating inertia from a regulatory standpoint, we've greatly hurt our economy and our GDP growth. And that has a direct impact on tax revenues, infrastructure, hospitals, education, healthcare, all the things that we come to believe are important parts of the Canadian experience. So moving forward, what will the policies be to try to balance off both those things, human flourishing, quality of life, while at the same time using human innovation, adaptation to deal with climate change? And hopefully that's where we're pivoting to. So you can see with the Liberal government, the Carney government, tax credits for carbon capture, clean electricity, clean tech manufacturing. Okay, so they're using the tax code to incentivize direction of investment in these areas. Now, again, I think this is not the time to do that. This is a really pivotal moment where getting capital as quickly as possible to where it needs to be invested to get the quickest and most productive gains from that invested capital is what we need to be doing, not tweaking around the edges and continue to move in the direction of technologies that may not be helpful for many years down the road. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do these things, but I do think that there's a hierarchy of priorities, and I didn't see that in the budget. I saw this continued movement towards this existential threat that I think a lot of people believe, which is climate, and moving money in the direction of technologies and areas that won't have an immediate impact on our economy. So the budget reality, it continues to frame our decisions around centralized control in which government is picking winners and losers. That is a terrible way to direct capital and reinvestment, where organizations, companies are relying on subsidies and tax credits to redirect capital. The government has consistently had a horrible track record in picking winners and losers. They should get out of the business of doing that, and they should let the real part of the economy, the free market, businesses and individuals to make those decisions. This continued commitment to net zero, carbon capture tax credits, green oil and gas, industrial carbon tax, the whole carbon tax issue and carbon capture, it's a little bit of voodoo science and economics. Maybe it's something we need to be doing, but in this current environment, I don't think it's the right solution. Our political system is currently broken, and so is the budget. And what I mean by that is we're in this terrible situation where, from a political standpoint, we have provinces like Quebec who want to get transfer payments. They're perfectly willing to get money from Saskatchewan and Alberta that principally gets generated from resource royalty revenue, yet want to restrict the ability to get pipelines to tidewaters through to Atlantic Canada. That needs to stop. The Carney government needs to use their federal powers to enforce the development of that pipeline, as an example, to get our energy out to tidewater, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, so we can get the world price. We're getting a reduced price because our major buyer of our energy is the U.S. It's ridiculous. So on top of that, if we look at our political system, we talk about dealing with interprovincial trade barriers. We've made no progress in that area. While we continue to be talking about different potential solutions, but we're not taking action. And so part of this discussion is holding your elected officials to account to begin doing the things so we can take our own sovereign control over our economies and not blame the U.S., not blame the Trump administration, but take captive control. It's one of those moments, I think, in time where a lot of us are very busy. We're preoccupied. We're dealing with our own problems and issues and families. This is one of those moments, no matter what part of the political spectrum you're in, to get your politicians engaged in practical solutions that will help improve our economic situation. Policies that will not lead to Canada being an energy superpower. And what I mean by that is this document does not lead to that. We'll become an energy superpower if the Carney government listens to the oil and gas industry on how we can take the handcuffs off them and allow them to do what business does best so we can get our fair share of profits and revenues, eventually finding its way into government revenues, to resource royalty revenues, to build out infrastructure and get the productivity gains that we so desperately need. And then lastly, the capital budget category is accounting sleight of hand. The parliamentary budget officers come out recently and said that. I think in principle, the idea of separating operational expenses and capital expenses, I guess could make sense, but you better be very picky in terms of what you categorize as capital expenses. So I think we'd agree that infrastructure, dams, roads, those kinds of investments, even in research and development, that lead to productivity gains are important initiatives, and government can play a very important role. But don't use this accounting change to be doing sleight of hand changes, like moving 300,000 civil servants to the military to meet your NATO targets. Higher interest costs will lead to less money in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Again, if we don't make this turnaround, there's a very real possibility we could get a downgrading on our debt. And that has a ripple effect, not just on federal debt, but provincial debt. For many provincial governments, the federal government is the guarantor. And so that could have a devastating impact. We don't want the same situation we saw during the Chrétien period, where Paul Martin had to introduce a budget and led to massive transfer payments that were cut. And we had in Manitoba Film and Fridays, we had massive shutdowns of hospitals in Saskatchewan. We had a devastating impact. So far, I probably sounded frustrated, negative, a little bit cynical. But let's pivot now, and I'm going to try to be a little more positive. So there are things we can do. It starts with having a conversation, and that conversation drifting into your circle of friends, then maybe eventually into events, then maybe it hits the zeitgeist of the population. Eventually, politicians grab hold of it, and then you see this generalized movement towards the need to change and pivot. So the first thing is make investment and entrepreneurship more attractive. Make it cool. In the United States, it's cool to be a successful business person. So what do we need to do from a tax system standpoint? Accessing capital, making that easier, regulatory hurdles. This presentation is not about how to practically do that, but there are solutions out there. Let's start pursuing them. The next thing is reduce red tape and internal trade barriers. This is so crazy. Back in the summer of this year, we're talking about the premiers dealing with interprovincial trade barriers, and there's all this kumbaya. Nothing's been done, right? So why are we not holding our politicians to account here? This is a massive one where you can get trade and productivity gains just from this one area. Let's get those interprovincial trade barriers gone. Let's stop allowing special interest groups to fossilize and slow down the economic experience in Canada. Push competition and technology adoption. Now, this is where I think you can use the tax system to incentivize companies to adopt technology to get productivity gains. It's one of the main reasons, not the only reason, one of the main reasons you've seen a differential between U.S. productivity gains and Canadian productivity. It's because of technology. Fix housing and infrastructure. Again, that could unleash economic development. It can deal with sort of the generational divide that we're facing as a country. But it does take some leadership at the federal level, because I think you're not going to get municipal governments or provinces to play ball unless the federal government threatens through maybe pulling back funding or not cooperating in other areas to get eventually municipalities and local governments to approve zoning and to fast track development. So I made this comment before, not in my backyard. You've got wealthy people with homes. They've wrote up that appreciation. They don't want higher density housing in their areas or zoning they just don't feel would be conducive to their prices. And they're slowing down or shutting down development. We need to stop that, and we need to override that impulse to help the next generation get into housing. Fully use the skills of people who are already here and the immigrants we bring in. This is a crazy one. I heard one doctor, immigrant to this country, give testimony to House of Commons committee. I think the number is like 100,000 immigrant doctors in this country, well-trained apparently, can't work because of certification guidelines. Let's get creative here. Like, how do we get these people productively working in our system? And then you get back to cross-border issues between the provinces. You have architects, engineers, nursing, teachers, all facing barriers from a certification standpoint, moving from one province to another. Are you kidding me? If you've been trained and certified and started working as an architect in Manitoba, okay, BC, other provinces, are there any restrictions? If there are, let's get rid of those. This is craziness. Cut personal corporate income taxes. I talked about that before. If you want a fast reallocation of capital in a smart way at the micro level to grow the economy, that's one of the quickest ways you're going to do that. And allow individuals to get money reinvested, whether it's to businesses, their own personal consumption, spending, and services, and that money gets into the system right away and has an almost immediate positive impact to the economy. And then government, you need to get out of the way. If there is any time for governments to step aside and reduce the inertia, given the current period we're in economically, this is one of those periods. Here are some other ideas to think about. Reduce RIF minimums. Maybe you can take the pressure off your retirees or trying to make the money go further, and you're trying to allow them to have longer-term income security. No capital gains if profits are reinvested back into Canadian projects and Canadian investment opportunities. Wouldn't that supercharge reinvestment back into Canadian opportunities? Family joint tax filing. It's crazy that we have basically almost perfect income splitting opportunities for retirees when we've got Canadian families struggling under the weight of costs and home purchases and that kind of thing. Let's allow for some more efficiencies with families to try to reduce the overall tax burden and make family decisions based on the family situation, not on individual tax filing. Tax-free withdrawals from registered accounts to help family members with first-time home purchases. Allowing people to free up capital to help family members for what is a very expensive and long journey to get into home ownership. And push back the adoption of industrial carbon tax regimes. Pivot when necessary, not proactively. Adoption currently is not a competitive advantage. I know that Carney and the Carney government talk like it is. Hey, we're importing oil from Venezuela, from the Saudis. We don't require them to have an industrial carbon tax and pursue carbon capture. So let's be smart right now. Let's try to reduce all the inertia. And I'm not saying that these are not technologies that we shouldn't explore. I think maybe it's part of the long-term solution. But let's be smart about the adoption. Let's not penalize Canada right now until we get our economic house in order, and then we can begin looking at these regimes. We're 1.5% of global emissions. So the focus of these kinds of initiatives should be on China or India. This shouldn't be on Canada. And if those particular jurisdictions are not adopting these technologies and these policies, it's just a kiss of death to us if we're adopting them. We're at a massive competitive disadvantage by moving in this direction when other major industrial powerhouses are not doing that. So I hope you found this overview helpful. Obviously, from my perspective, we're pivoting in the wrong direction. We've had 10 years of failed policy. I don't think the policies being pursued right now are strong enough to move the needle in any significant way in the short to medium term. We need to focus on strategies that improve the lot financially for average Canadians right away. I've talked about some of those policy recommendations. And hopefully, as Canadians, we can be a little more reflective and balanced in our thinking as we try to find a medium ground that's going to make a difference for people. So hope you found the overview helpful, maybe thought-provoking. You probably don't agree with me in some of these issues, but let's start conversations. Let's start struggling through these issues and holding government to account in terms of their use of hard-earned tax dollars and policy directives. You take care.